Ukraine is preparing to attack Israel?
So look, we're going to continue to monitor the situation. I hope you saw the statement from the Department of Defense this past Friday on what they're doing with their force posture adjustments, preparing, making sure that we are giving Israel that increased support that they need. In the meantime, we're going to continue to have these conversations. We're going to continue to try to do everything that we can to de-escalate the tensions, hence the readouts that we put out today and also yesterday. That's going to be our focus. Anything else, I don't have anything beyond that, but we're continuing to monitor everything closely. Good, Emma.
Thanks, Corinne. A couple questions for you. Now that Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, is he getting the intelligence briefings that it's traditional for presidential nominees to get?
So that's something for ODNI to speak to. I would refer you to them.
And then here at the White House, have you guys started the transition process, and who's going to be in charge of that? And
why are you trying to kick us out already? We've got 5 months.
It's a lot more work than people realize to pack up an administration.
I don't have anything to share about that at this time. Okay. Go ahead. Good. No, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Corinne. On foreign policy, starting with Venezuela, can the White House clarify where it stands on Edmundo Gonzalez? Does the administration see him as a legitimate president of Venezuela? And if so, what steps are you taking or preparing to take to, legitimize him?
So a couple of things. And I believe the State Department put out a statement just last week. So I'll say this, the United States has been in close coordination with regional and international partners following Venezuela's presidential election on June 28th and rapid declaration of the National Electoral Council that Nicolas Maduro won without evidence. This is a critical moment for democracy in our shared hemisphere. The opposition and civil society have published more than 80% of the tally sheets received from polling stations throughout Venezuela, which indicate that Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia received the most votes by an insurmountable margin. Independent observers, pre-election and exit polls, and quick counts corroborated these results. The will of the people must be respected. At least 12 million Venezuelans courageously went to the polls despite significant challenges and exercised their democratic right to vote. Now is the time for the Venezuelan parties to begin a respectful, peaceful dialogue and discussions in accordance with their laws and the votes of the people to chart the path forward for a more democratic, prosperous, and also secure Venezuela. So I'd reiterate the United States' commitment to supporting this process of reestablished democratic norms in Venezuela and stand ready to consider ways to bolster these efforts jointly with our international partners.
On Iran, and then I do have a question about Bangladesh, because of course it's very timely, but let me start with Iran. Pakistan said at a recent OIC meeting that they would willingly supply Iran with mid-range missiles if the war continues. Has the administration spoken to Islamabad about this, expressed concerns, and if so, what's the message?
I mean, I think we've been very clear with our message, right? I've said, somebody asked me, how do we communicate with Iran? Obviously, we have our partners out there that does the communications. We have ways to do that. Obviously, I'm not going to lay that out. Other ways to do that, I'm not going to lay that out from here. But I think we've been very clear. We've been very clear in our support for Israel and making sure they have what they need to defend themselves. And I don't think that you can look at this administration and not know what the message has been and what we have been very clear about. And so when we send messages to Iran, it is within our interest, and I'll just leave it there.
Okay, then quickly on Bangladesh, concerning events in Dhaka, has the White House reached out to parties in Dhaka, and what would you like to see happen next?
So we're monitoring the situation in Bangladesh very closely. We have long called for respective democratic rights in Bangladesh, and we urge that the interim government formation be democratic and inclusive. We commend the army for the restraint they have showed. We encourage all parties to refrain from further violence and restore peace as quickly as possible. We express our deep concern and sadness about the reports of casualties and injuries over the weekend and past weeks, and we share our deepest condolences with those who lost loved ones and those who are suffering. It will be vital for the new government to carefully and credibly investigate all attacks and provide accountability and justice for victims. Go ahead, Garen.
Today is the 59th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And data from the Brennan Center for Justice shows that since the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the VRA, voter turnout gaps between black and brown voters and white voters has continued to grow. Given President Biden's executive order on expanding access to voter registration, is there any update the White House can provide to that? And does the president see the issue of voting rights as a top priority? Does he believe that he can have some renewed efforts to get those bills passed in Congress?
So look, as you know, today is the anniversary of 1965 voting rights. I believe the vice president put out called for a day of action today. So that's important to highlight the need, as you just stated, of federal legislation and to also to encourage all eligible Americans to exercise their right to vote. I think that is something that not just obviously the vice president and the president have spoken to since almost day one of their administration, when the president signed an executive order to do everything that we can from the federal level to make sure that voting is more accessible, more easily accessible to Americans across the country. And that is something that the president understands and continues to do everything that we can to make that happen. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, that is something that we want to see get done. We have to see legislation. In order to deal with this issue, we have to see legislation. And so we're going to continue to call on that. Congress has to do everything that they can to protect our freedom to vote. And so it is part of our democracy. And so in the meantime, we're working to ensure that every eligible American can exercise their right to vote and have their vote counted. And I can assure you that is something both the president and the vice president are committed to. And you saw that because of him signing the EO very early on in his administration, I believe on day one of his administration.
Another question.
Yeah.
As the vice president begins her battleground state travels this week, many black and brown Americans are still looking to learn more about the vice president, particularly her work here at the White House. And given that, can you speak to the role the vice president had played in advising or crafting some of this administration's signature equity policies, whether that be Justice 40 investments in infrastructure and climate, or investments in black businesses, et cetera?
I mean, look, they're partners. The president and the vice president have been critical partners. They are. They're partners in everything that has been done come out of this administration, the Biden-Harris administration. And you just mentioned a few things, right? You think about the CHIPS and Science Acts, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the PACT Act, all of these important critical legislation, the American Rescue Plan, Inflation Reduction Act. Those are legislation that she was very involved in. And at the center of those historical piece of legislation, you had equity. Equity was always at the center of that, making sure no community is left behind. And so she's been at the table. She has been giving voice to these critical decisions that they both made together. And they recognize the advancing equity is a generational commitment. That requires sustained federal leadership. That requires to make sure that we partner with our communities as well. And so this is something that we are going to continue to do. We talk about the next 5 months. Obviously, this is something that this president and the Biden-Harris administration wants to continue to do and uphold. I mentioned today how the vice president called today a day of action because it is an anniversary of 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so we are acutely aware. We are acutely aware of what's going on. And that's why the president, on day one, signed that executive action.
Thanks, Fran. A couple of questions on disparate topics. One of the president's aspirations for the remainder of his term is Supreme Court reform or restructuring, however you want to term it. At the weekend, Justice Gorsuch said in a TV interview, quote, "I just say, be careful." Does the White House have any response either to the implication of that lack of carefulness? Or
No, I'm not going to comment to the justice. The president made himself very clear. Over a week ago, he went to Austin, Texas, went to LBJ Library, gave a very, I believe, important speech. He believes an important speech on reform and for SCOTUS, right? Supreme Court reform. It is important. He laid out 3 ways to get to that point. A lot of that, obviously, those 3 ways that he laid out is supported. Many of that is supported by conservatives, experts on this. And look, the president believes that nobody's above the law. Nobody's above the law. The highest court of the land should not be above the law. And he wants to work with Congress on making that happen. He laid that out very, very clearly. I'm not going to respond to the justice.
And just a very different
Yeah, sure.
topic, Corinne. We're just a day or two away from the 1-year anniversary of the wildfires that
Yeah.
affected Maui and specifically Lahaina so seriously. As far as I know, there are a number of people still struggling with long-term housing needs and so forth.
Yeah.
What's the federal government doing about that?
So we want to take a moment to remember the 102 individuals whose lives were lost and thousands of survivors whose lives were changed, forever changed, because of what happened almost a year ago. In April, the temporary elementary school opened for the hundreds of students displaced by the fires, providing the students with the assurance they would have a school to return to by the end of the summer. FEMA continues to work closely with state officials. That is something, obviously, FEMA is committed to, and relocate survivors from hotel. This is a long-term process. We understood that this would not take weeks or months. This is going to take some time. But FEMA continues to work on this. You have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers continues to make significant progress. The president made clear when he visited Maui that this administration will continue to do everything that it can to make sure that people get back on its feet. It's a long process, but we're still there. I just mentioned the U.S. Army Corps, I just mentioned FEMA, and we're going to continue to do everything that we can to get folks back on their feet. But also do not want to forget the lives that were lost.
If we were to see the president this week and he were to discuss what's happening on Wall Street, is there a direct message he could say to investors to prevent a future sell-off like the one we saw earlier this
Look,
week?
I'm not going to speak to that directly. What I'm going to speak to is the economy as we see it right now, as we view it. It is resilient. That is what's important. I've laid out the data points of why we believe this economy continues to be resilient. We are going to focus on what matters to the American people also, which is make sure that we lower costs for them. That's going to be our focus. Our economic team, they're going to monitor everything closely. They're going to update the president and the vice president, and that's what we're going to focus on. Okay.
Thank you. 2 weeks ago, the president said he would appoint a new director to the Secret Service following the resignation of former Director Cheadle. Is there an update on that process? Could it happen before the election, or perhaps it's after the election? Is there any update on the independent review?
So this is not about politics. It's not about the election here. This is about making sure that we find the right person for the job. The president has always taken that very seriously when it comes to appointing people for important positions here in this administration. I don't have a timeline, an update for you at this time, but the president is thinking through this, wants to make sure that we have the right person for the job, and once we have an announcement, obviously, we will share that with all of you. Okay.
Update on the independent review into the Trump assassination attempt?
I don't have an update on the independent review. Obviously, when we saw the assassination attempt of the former president, the president took that very seriously. He spoke right after, talked about wanting to make sure that we had an independent review, wanted to make sure that the American people got the answers, and so they're going to continue to work on that, and also talked about lowering the rhetoric, right? Making sure that we lower the temperature. He condemned that act of violence. There should be no form of violence in our politics, and so he's going to continue to be very clear about that. The review continues. Once they have more to share, certainly we will share that with all of you. Toulouse.
Thank you. Republicans are attacking Governor Walz as a radical liberal. They pointed to his policies on climate, on gender, on free school meals for children, free tuition. One Republican congressman said that the Harris-Walz ticket would be a socialist dream, and I wonder if you have a response from the White House on this.
I mean, look, I think this is some place where I would refer you to, obviously, the president's statement about Governor Walz, and I certainly will leave it there. But when it comes to the Biden-Harris administration, we cannot forget we inherited a skyrocketing murder rate. That's something that we inherited from the prior administration. And working together, we were not only turned that around, but have brought violent crime to a 50-year low. That is something that the president was able to do with his partnership with the vice president. And, we want to continue to make sure that we, for example, when we think about gun crime, we want to continue to work on that. And we were able to pass a legislation that we hadn't seen on fighting gun violence in 30 years. That is something that the president and this vice president has been able to do. So we have taken this really seriously. And right now, majority of House Republicans want to defund the police by cutting the COPS program. If you think about the American Rescue Plan, the reason why we're able to deal with crime in this country, Republicans didn't vote on it. Not one Republican voted for the American Rescue Plan. So I think we have shown how much we want to deliver for the American people. That is what this administration is about. This administration is about, it doesn't matter if you're a red state or blue state. The president wants to make sure he's delivering for the American people, and that's his focus. And you saw that from the, obviously, vice president being partners. That's the focus.
One more on former Speaker Pelosi. She was on television yesterday. She was asked whether or not she's spoken to the president since he dropped out of the presidential race. She said she had not. She was asked if their relationship was okay, and she said you'd have to ask him. So what is the status of the relationship with the president and the former speaker?
As far as the last time they spoke, I'm not going to get into private communications here or conversations, just not going to speak to that. Look, President Biden respects his good friend, Speaker Pelosi. We believe it's mutual. And her statement, I'll just read it to you all here. His legacy of vision, values, and leadership make him one of the most consequential presidents in American history. With love and gratitude to President Biden for always believing in the promise of America and giving people the opportunity to reach their fulfillment. God blessed America with Joe Biden's greatness and goodness. Again, he respects his good friend, former Speaker Pelosi, and we believe it's mutual, as I just read her quote right after he made his decision. All right, everybody, I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.